What's up, everybody? Welcome to the next video on my channel, and today we will be covering how scaling actually functions on a very fundamental level, the different types of scaling that there is and what it looks like. I'll have examples for you. This is coming right after finishing the Naruto series, and I wanted to kind of bridge the gap because, of course, I scale Naruto a lot lower than you'll find elsewhere. A lot of that has to do with my AAAP scaling, where we're actually trying to be as accurate as possible, where, we're not going to just take assertions and say they are true. We're going to look at actual feats and scaling. Now, a big part of that is the scaling side. So, aside from, AAAP scaling methods, alongside understanding how AP works, both of those play a big role, especially the AP side, plays a big role in why the Naruto series scaled where it did. But now, lastly, scaling in of itself, because we're looking at feats and scaling. That led me to this video, because I will be going on to different series. Won't be doing Naruto for a long time, or Boruto at least, right? And I wanted to make this so that there is a clear reason that you and anybody else could follow going into all my future scaling, and feel free to backtrack this to any of my previous scaling as well as the Naruto one, and you will see that it all lines up. So let's get into scaling fundamentals. We're going to be covering the different types of scaling there are, why they're relevant, and the degree to which they differ and influence the scaling as a whole in any given series. Now, with these examples that I'll be providing, some might include spoilers for such series as, let's say, Mashle, if that's how you can pronounce it. And additionally, I'll be bringing up fringe or specific cases that play out in different series that can heavily impact the scaling, as well as hypotheticals. With all that said, let's jump into the first branch of scaling. We have linear and non-linear scaling. All scaling, necessarily so, must be one of these two. And a series can switch between the two at any given time. But to make it clear, here's how I consider them. Linear scaling is any scaling that follows a 1-to-1 ratio or nearly a 1-to-1 ratio in any given thing, usually stats, such as, say, a 50 times increase being an actual 50 times increase to X things, and not just, say, energy as a whole that has some trickle-down effect to stats, as an example, right? So, some examples of linear scaling would include Super Saiyan, or the Shikai in Bleach, or even Meliodas with his clones that actually nerf his stats via a division of power. But it's a linear scale in that division of power, or multiplier in some of those. Each one of these lend themselves to being linear in their scaling to the character pre-power up, or pre-move, and whatever with Meliodas or something. But then we have non-linear scaling. What would that be, right? Okay, so non-linear scaling is simply scaling that holds no set ratio for any increases or decreases, such as, again, say, a 50 times increase applying to the overall, say, energy system, such that it instead boosts the character by less or more than 50 times. The 50 times increase in this case could apply in almost any way, and some examples of such scaling include, say, Naruto tailed forms, or Toguro forms, Doom forms, and others. Each of these examples fail to show a 1-to-1 ratio to any given thing. Naruto's tailed forms vary quite a bit, though with no set gain in stats, but it's clearly much stronger than previous. Still never shows each tail having a 1-to-1 gain in whatever stats we'd expect. Toguro and Doom. Now, they're actually a lot more consistent. They're also a lot more consistent in terms of how their power works, unlike, the tails to Naruto. Additionally, they're also, literally the same thing, Toguro and Doom, in terms of how they're scaling and, what they're looking to do. Almost exactly the same power. Hilarious, really. When I read the fight in Mashle, is this just Yusuke versus Toguro all over again? Really good series. Anyways, Toguro and Doom, they're different series, but they both are increasing by a mere percentage of power, and yet getting at least a 2 times multiplier in stats. Now, that is clearly non-linear, not a 1-to-1 ratio. 10% is not a 10% increase, it's a 2 times increase, which would be percentage-wise, a 10% to their overall selves is a 100% increase to stats. Okay, so hopefully these two categories are making sense because these are both in just one branch of scaling. We have one more branch, and it's both branches together that paint the entire picture. So linear and non-linear are fine. But the second branch of scaling includes the level of scaling, and that involves additive, multiplicative, and exponential scaling. First, additive. Should be clear, but for additive scaling, the scaling simply adds the power, or subtracts, of any given source to any given thing already shown, where a 50 times increase is really, instead of a 50 times more powerful version, is just a set amount of power that in that moment in time is making them 50 times more powerful, but could in the future just make them 5 times more powerful, even with the same exact boost, right? Likewise, if somehow they were to lose a character, right? If they were to lose all their power except that additive boost, such as say their base power is sealed, then we could expect that 50 times increase to be much higher in that circumstance, where if it was 50 times, but it's an additive boost, and now they've lost all their base power, now it could be like 1,000,000 times boost because they're starting from like a 0 instead of say a 1,000 if we're gonna like measure PL or something, right? So that's where that's coming. This is additive scaling. Now to be clear, additive scaling is quite hard to find examples of, and although basic in foundation, is quite rare in fiction. An example of direct additive scaling, however, would be something like the gear that's equipped on characters in Dragon Quest Dai. Each gear has its own stats that add directly to the stats of the wielder and function as such. Very easy. Examples of power-ups that could be additive include Naruto's tailed forms, or potentially even the entire power system behind Naruto that I personally didn't treat as additive, but has a multitude of realistic arguments for. And then separately from Naruto, potentially the power of devils in Black Clover as well when taking their power to the hosts. Black Clover, however, I've yet to do AAAP scaling for, so take that with a grain of salt. That's why I said potentially their power, right? Could be an additive type of scaling. I just want to highlight how these examples do or could easily be additive scaling and what they have in common. That would be an increase in power separate from the character gaining the increase. Next up will be multiplicative scaling. And if additive is the most rare, multiplicative scaling is the most common. Not only is it basic in function, but is also intuitive for any given storyteller, as the increase is always directly tied to the thing being multiplied. And as the name suggests, it's when an increase or decrease is by a set multiplier of whatever is being affected. Not to repeat previous examples from linear scaling, we'd expect things like different, say, Luffy gears, certain nin abilities or usage, and many digivolutions. The important thing to note here is that while a 50 times increase is multiplicative, it's also beyond a factor of 10, aka exponential, and as such, certain things will be labeled multiplicative and others exponential for this video, and as an understanding in how I've personally laid out the foundation behind the types of scaling that go into each series I cover, I hope all of this is clear, the separation. This also, talking about multiplicative scaling, applies to each example that you can see on the screen, and is why I won't say all nin abilities or all digivolutions. But that brings us to the last one, exponential scaling. Now, this is by far the strongest type among the 3 types of scaling, though it could also be the weakest, and I'll go into details, but in general, if a series is going to have the strongest type of scaling, it requires exponential scaling. So, among the types, the 3 types, exponential, strongest, within this whole branch, and it should be obvious why. It requires not just any multiplier, but a minimum of 10 times per each increase labeled as exponential. That said, 10 times. Not everything is cut and dry, and so, like I said, why it could also be the weakest, Another reason I separate exponential and multiplicative is because you can have examples where the 10 or more times difference is compared to the baseline number of the increase or decrease. Okay, confusing, I know, but to borrow from the nonlinear section from the first branch, something like Toguro gaining a 2 times increase to stats is coming from a 10% increase to his totality of power. Now, 10% is 1/10 of 100%. And if his stats were to increase as a percentage 2 times, that is 100%, right? So he's getting a 100% increase to his stats from a 10% increase from his totality of power. I'm hoping this is very clear. I've now repeated it. This would be a 10 times difference, aka the difference for each 10% that he's getting is an exponential increase in power when comparing it to the increase itself. Maybe not to himself as a character, but to the increase that he's experiencing. 10% equating to a 100% increase, right? Okay. Hopefully this is clear. Another thing could be, again, I'll go into this later as well, but Naruto, there's Sage Mode, 10 times increase, things like that. But other characters, many characters with Sage Mode, it'll be like a 10 times increase kind of overall, I suppose. But generic baseline stats, there's nothing that suggests, and in fact, most things suggest the exact opposite, where you can never claim oh, Sage Mode 10 times, and now he is 10 times in every stat, 10 times faster, 10 times stronger. Not only do we not see that from pretty much any character, but different characters, actually from that 10 times, so to speak, get different variations of multipliers to their stats. It's more like they get a 10 times to their character, but in stats, that actually results in the opposite, right? And opposite of what Toguro experiences. So I'm hoping you see that exponential can apply, not that that's actually even exponential, mind you, it's more like multiplicative. Their 10 times isn't resulting in 1/10 of a gain to their stats. It is higher than that. It's multiplicative, not exponential. I'm just trying to show that it can go both ways. And exponential scaling could be, I got 100 times more powerful to my character as an energy source, just how the world functions, and that results in only a 10 times increase to my stats. That would also be an exponential difference. Okay. Now, other examples of exponential increases or exponential scaling would also include things like Bankai at the high end, that 10 times, or any Bankai compared to a character's base, where even if it's 5 times and then 5 times again, it's 5 times the Shikai, which is already 5 times the base, aka the minimum is 25 times. That's above a 10 times multiplier to their base. We could look at Dai's Crest when it's activated, or Hiei absorbing the dragon, right? In these examples, each boost is at minimum 10 or more times higher. And that will do it for the second branch of scaling. I'm really hoping that it is clear. Now, technically, there is one final type of scaling that I'd label as irregular, which is mostly used in comic relief parts of a series or a comedy-based series as a whole. I will be ignoring this. Just know that it can kind of show up in different series. And it's basically just scaling with no set pattern of any kind. Alright, moving beyond irregular scaling, let's look at both branches of scaling so we have a full picture. Now, on the left, we have linear and nonlinear with the examples. On the right, we have additive, multiplicative, and exponential scaling with their examples. Now, what I want is for those of you watching or listening to consider, why do I have these two branches? Why separate them? Now, feel free to pause if needed, but to get to the answer, okay, the reason I separate these two branches of scaling is because none of them cover the totality of scaling on their own. And furthermore, it's only by combining an option from both sides that you can ever get a totality of scaling being used within a series. That means for branch 2, any of those options could be linear or nonlinear, and it must be one of them, and as much as anyone may want to simplify it, without an understanding of linear and non-linear scaling, you'll never correctly identify proper scaling from branch 2 types alone. Reread some examples if needed, as I made sure to include ones that hit different conclusions despite being the same type of scaling. If you think you can just say it's multiplicative and ignore if it's linear or not, how could you ever properly assess the power of a Shikai boost, for example? You literally would not be able to. Linear and nonlinear likewise must pair with a type within branch 2 to have a full picture as well. And lastly, as you can see with the things that are in their branch, it's because they can't be simultaneously the things in that branch, but they can be simultaneously one from one branch and one from the other. But something cannot be linear and nonlinear, which is why it's one branch. And for the other things, while linear can be anything in branch 2 and nonlinear can be anything in branch 2, likewise for branch 2, something cannot be multiplicative and additive. And I know that there's kind of the wordplay with, like, not wordplay, but you can say something that's exponential can be multiplicative for the purpose of understanding the bracket difference of the 10 times minimum. If we're going to really define it, I suppose we could say something cannot be less than 10 times difference and more than 10 times difference at the same time, which is fundamentally how I'm using multiplicative and exponential, because it does matter a lot for the scaling as a whole. Exponential just is a whole different bracket of power. So that's why they are in their different branches. So what does all this mean? Say you understand all of this, and feel free to ask any questions in the comments below. Be happy to answer, alright? Say you know all this. Why then do I seem to have certain series higher than they seem, such as, say, Yu Hakusho, and others lower than they seem, such as Naruto? It's not just the AAAP scaling for accuracy and an understanding of AP. Both are so important. But it's also an understanding all these different types of scaling. Yu Hakusho is clearly not only exponential in scaling, but of a non-linear basis. I would argue the highest tier type of scaling for power. Any series that is using a non-linear in the positive, because it could go negative, but in a positive non-linear basis on an exponential increase will result in the highest type of scaling. It doesn't mean it will be the strongest series, but it will have the strongest type of scaling. So yes, Yu Hakusho is non-linear exponential. Examples of this are very evident and come from the absolute smallest of increases, which is why it's exponential, to the self. So the smallest increases of power to the self as a whole will net massive differences in power to those without those tiny increases. Consider Hiei versus Seiryu. This is but one example. Hiei is suppressed via not using his demon form, which is already a multiplier in certain stats, not exponential. And yet, he still blitzes Seiryu, and with one-shot capability. Any of those slashes could have just been a simple decapitation if you wanted. Cutting straight through him, literally like butter. Hiei would be far stronger than Seiryu, right? I mean, he's blitzing him with one-shot potential. It doesn't get much more blatant than that. So far stronger, right? Well, in other series, yes. In Yu Hakusho, not so much. Technically, yes. Kind of no, and I'll explain. In Yu Hakusho, Hiei's battle power would be seen as almost equal to that of Seiryu, not vastly superior. Yet, again, we have a full blitz with one-shot AP. But both are D-class demons, and I don't mean upper D-class, which there's even in Yu Hakusho, there's lower, mid, and upper classifications of each letter, E to S. Both are base D-class demons. The second weakest type there of classification there is. And I'll get to the classifications of power in a bit, but first, let's look at Naruto real quick. Besides absolute fodder, almost no one has such a feat done against them. They at least react, fight back, take hits even if injured, or catch the dominant person off guard to some degree. A feat on par with Hiei versus Seiryu when it comes to scaling that difference in Naruto, that would suggest a very large difference in power between the two characters. And this is where classifications are coming in. In Yu Yu Hakusho, there are classifications, again, E through S class, but more so, these are classifications of power, directly having to do with power, speed, etc., and we see such throughout. In Naruto, Genin to Hokage are also classifications. However, none of them have to do with power. A Genin could easily be stronger than a Chunin or anything else. Nothing limits it, actually limits that. Like, Shikamaru did not become more powerful when he stopped being a Genin. So, again, when Hiei kills Seiryu in the fashion he did, we know via both being a mere D class that the difference between a low C class and Seiryu is some much higher number via the exponential increases. But in Naruto, there is no classification requiring such scaling, let alone exponential scaling. More examples, when Hiei fights Bui, he's a B class. When he absorbs the dragon in that same fight, a minimum of an 80 times boost to not just stats, but to his overall power used for the classification of power, he's still a B class, still base B, and is easily outscaled by the full power Toguro, who is also but an upper B class, giving us the exponential differences between even minor things like base B class to upper B class, let alone something like lower A as the next letter. So, back to Naruto. Where could we see something like this? Nowheres. There is nothing like this in the series, and these are types of scaling that matter a lot. So Naruto has nothing like this. Not only does it lack in exponential scaling, but it lacks in classifications of power that require necessary minimums in those jumps, and to help differentiate. The one thing they share, but not at all times, is being non-linear, where in Naruto, again, as I said previous, a 10 times increase can result in the inverse, where we see stats go up by far less than a 10 times, unlike, say, Toguro, and also at different rates for different characters. Sasuke seems to get more speed from his Sage energy than, say, Dorobo, right? Okay. All of this is simply to point out where a difference in scaling can come about. This is along with AAAP scaling accuracy methods and understanding AP instead of just DC or total joules, is why a series like Yu Yu Hakusho will always scale much higher than at first glance, and not so for Naruto, though also heavily due to understanding actual AP. That's a big part of it for Naruto as well. And feel free to see how each apply to different series. From Bleach to Seven Deadly Sins, Black Clover to Rurouni Kenshin. I think if you really understand the scaling types, you'll naturally see why different series scale to different lengths, even if they were to have similar feats at different points, and why I have different series where I do, and where I will going forward. I also, however, want to point out that you can go back to any of my previous videos and see that both branches fit perfectly with any and all scaling for any series I've covered beyond a single feat. If you were to go back and watch the entire Naruto series, you'll see a clear, non-linear, multiplicative scaling throughout. And that's stronger than what it could have been. Again, this series has a lot of examples for additive scaling. But as applied, the series is fully consistent from top to bottom. It's true for Yu Yu Hakusho, true for Bleach, true for everything I've done, and it will be true for the next series I'll be finishing, which will be Dragon Quest Dai's Adventure. Very excited. I started it, now it's time to finish it, which will be marking the first of my new list of series to cover on this channel. I want to thank each of you that did suggest a series for me to cover. Here it is. These are the series I'll be covering in the future, each in order. And that pretty much wraps this video up. I hope each example is clear enough for what it is, and I'll say one last time, feel free to ask any questions. All that said, hope you enjoyed the video today. Please like, comment, and especially subscribe. I'd love to hit 1,000 subs. Keep building this amazing community and continue to expand the understanding of AAAP scaling to more and more out there. I'll see you all in the next one. Ciao.